that, I'll turn it over to Jeremy.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. As Dar said, this is me. I'm Jeremy Handel. I'm the founder and managing partner of Handel Studio LLC. I met Dar a few months ago. It's actually kind of an interesting story. Basically, I'm friends with Anthony Broad-Crawford, who up until very, very recently was with Within3. He is moving on to something else. I don't know what, but he just announced that via all his social channels last week. And so Dar got a message from a journalist at the Plain Dealer. Hey, do you know of anybody in town who's working on gaming stuff? I'm trying to put together an article about games. Dar asked Anthony. Anthony mentioned me, and so we met up. He showed me around the Launchhouse, and we chatted a little bit about what we've both been doing. In terms of my own history, I've worked. I was one of those people that was on the 10-year plan for college. I wanted to be in English, then I wanted to be a psychologist, then I wanted to be a theoretical physicist. I eventually found out that what I really wanted to be was something that wasn't anything in particular. So I ended up getting a degree in what's called information resources. It's actually a library sciences degree from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. That led me to meet some people in Milwaukee who had me doing some 2D and 3D animation and design, mostly Flash, some action scripting, a little bit of web stuff, a little bit of PHP, MySQL, that kind of stuff. And that sort of, I ended up, when I left there, I was doing mostly work in Modo, 3D modeling and design, package prototyping, that kind of stuff. So that's who I am, that's where I come from. Tell you a little bit about Handel Studio. We were founded in September of 2009, basically on a whim. I did not buy the first iPhone, but I did buy an iPhone 3G, and I was totally blown away. I was like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And I started looking at the App Store and seeing that there were all these amazing ideas, but there were a few that I didn't see. And I kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And then finally I read a book called The Dip. I don't know if anybody here has ever read that book. But I read that, and it basically gave me the sort of the kick in the pants I needed. It's like, if someone else is not doing the thing and you think that you should be done, you go do it. Why not? So I did. Started it part-time. We first published our very first app. I met a technical co-founder, as they always say that you got the sort of the business guy and then the technical co-founder, who lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And we published our first app in August of 2010, and that was an app called Style Assist. It is no longer in the App Store. We've pulled it because it was underperforming, and we didn't feel like spending any more money trying to make it perform. It basically was a utility for tracking hairstyles. You could basically take a couple pictures of your hair whenever you got it done. It was an app I made for my wife, and because she had moved from Milwaukee to Cleveland and realized that she had to break in a new stylist, and she wished she had a history of every hairstyle she'd ever gotten. Seems like a great idea, right? The lesson there is learn marketing first. Learn how to market your app. We are focused on mobile, primarily iOS, but we've recently made some inroads into Android with GameMinder, which I'll talk about in a minute. We have basically 4 main products that you may or may not have been aware of. The first one is called Couplet. It is an app that uses both of the cameras on your phone at the same time, or your iPad, to sort of capture moments from both sides. You then sort of put a theme on it and share it. It's a really quick, really simple app. It's about to crack 100,000 downloads, maybe 1 or 2 more days. So we're pretty psyched about that. Second one, which I was chatting a little bit about before we started here, is a game called Uncle Slam. It's president on president boxing. Basically you pick your president, and it's all gesture-based. We originally did it for iPad because it looks really phenomenal on the big screen, but we ended up miniaturizing it for the iPhone. So it's a universal app now. And it's actually going to go free to play probably in the next 2 weeks. We've been selling it for $2, and it's doing okay, but we really want to get it in people's hands before the election. We just released a pack that basically has Obama and Romney, and you can sort of pit them against each other, and we're tracking globally the stats. If you can believe this, Romney's actually 52% right now. So
Anybody played that yet? Oh, that's awesome.
we can show it around a little bit afterward. It's a pretty fun little game. And then the third big one right now is GameMinder. And I'm going to mention this now. You'll see that I've got a hashtag up behind me here, GameMinder360. And right now we're running a promotion with a company called Rooster Teeth. If anybody here is into gaming, specifically Halo, you might have heard of Rooster Teeth. They do the red versus blue sort of machinima, which is using a game engine to make movies. And so we're doing a promotion right now. We're giving away an Xbox 360 signed by their entire team. And the only thing you need to do to enter is tweet with that hashtag. So if you want to maybe win an Xbox 360, go ahead and tweet that. We're trying to get it to globally trend over the next 2 days. We're giving it away on Friday. And as I mentioned, GameMinder we just published for Android as well. because it started as an iOS app, as an iOS-only app, and we realized as many people as are using iOS, there's a lot of gamers that are not. And so we decided, this was an idea that started as an iOS app, but we learned over time is actually a much bigger idea than just simply an iOS app. And so we're actually in the process of transitioning that now. I mentioned before we started that we're actually rebuilding it now in Ruby so that we can build it into a much more robust, user-centered, almost social network for video games. And what it does is it tracks video game release dates. It's pretty simple. That's what it does now. We expect for it to do a lot more as we move forward. But none of these are our most well-performing app. Our most well-performing app is Reminder. And the free version of Reminder is also, like with Couplet, it's about to crest right over a big milestone. We're about to hit 500,000 downloads on that one. We're pretty excited about it. And then there's a paid Pro version, which adds a bunch of additional features. And so this is our sort of like our golden child app. It's a very simple app. We don't really market it. It keeps itself going kind of very organically. It's a very crowded space, Reminder apps. There's hundreds of them. But if you do it right, you can do pretty well. So I was actually going to do like a quick show of hands thing, but we kind of did that when we went around. So I know that there are quite a few people here who do write code for a living. There are a number who have worked on mobile apps. There are a number who have worked on iOS, and there are also a number who are going to be working on iOS in the near future. I did actually see that there was somebody who used to work at Apple who said that they were coming. Did he show up? No? That's too bad. I was really interested to see what he thought about my presentation. Okay, so we've kind of covered this a little bit. Now, the pace of mobile development is pretty quick. As a couple of people had already mentioned, I had worked on it a couple years ago, but I want to see what's been happening lately. It moves so fast that a lot of people actually think it's maybe moving a little bit too fast. So I'm going to say something now that may be a little controversial to developers, but I think in a room full of startup-oriented folks, I don't think it'll be as controversial. What you should be doing moving forward, specifically with regards to iOS, is designing for the newest OS with an eye to the future and abandoning the old OS as soon as you can, if not sooner. Our sort of rule of thumb at Handel is once our analytics show us that 80% of our users are on the most recent version, that's when we begin coding the next update that's going to drop support for that version. And then we actually drop support when it hits 90. So we basically abandon 10% of our users for several reasons. One, if they're not updated to the most recent version of the OS, it's a pretty good bet they're not going to update to the most recent version of our app. And we also know that the App Store is not going to offer it to them on device if their device doesn't support it. It's a really good way to sort of forcefully bring your user base forward. And the cool thing about this is that Apple does a lot of this. Apple is very much about moving the ball down the field. They move as fast as they can. Again, almost too fast. A lot of people might have noticed that Mountain Lion came out today. macOS 10.8, a scant year after 10.7, which is the fastest I think they've ever released a major update, with the exception of maybe 10.1 after 10.0, which wasn't really a release. It was more like a beta. So some ways that they're doing this. They've built a lot of sort of supporting technologies into their stuff that are doing this. So they do over-the-air updates to iOS now, which means you don't have to plug into iTunes and actually like run the installer. Excuse me, as I said, a predictable yearly schedule, which they've actually completely countered the way that Apple's usually worked. They've actually announced we are going to be doing a yearly update schedule for macOS 10 and iOS now. So we can actually plan for that. Automatic downloading of updates in the background. This has been sort of there on the Mac side for a while now, but it's actually coming to iOS now. It actually started in iOS 5. You might have noticed if you plugged in like your iPad or your iPhone overnight, you might wake up and say, there's an update to your iOS, would you like to do it now? What you don't know is that they probably actually already downloaded it for you and stored it on the device if you had room, and you just have to push a button and it'll do it for you. So they're, like I said, they're pushing everybody forward. They're dragging people forward if they need to. And then, like I said, abandonment of older versions. Now, on Apple's side, this also means that they abandon old hardware, which can be a sticking point for some people. It's not really for me. I like to have the newest, coolest stuff, but I understand that sometimes you can't always have that. But like I said, this is just what Apple's doing. The good news is it seems to be working pretty well. This slide went up at Worldwide Developer Conference. This is Crazy Eyes Forstall. He's the head of the iOS team. And this slide, he made a couple snarky remarks. But basically what you can see here is that 80% of active iOS users are on the most recent version of the operating system. And if you count just one version back, it's well over 95%. Comparing that to the biggest competition in the mobile space, which is Android, you can see the vast majority are still in 2.2 and 2.3. And in fact, there are still devices shipping with those and with no necessarily clear upgrade path for whether those users will ever get to upgrade. I'm not going to get into a lot of iOS, Android sort of stuff, other than to say that if you look at this, I think you know, based on which platform you're targeting, where you should be aiming. When we built out GameMinder, we aimed for 2.2. But when we're building the next version of GameMinder for iOS, we're going to probably aim for iOS 6, just because that's what the numbers are telling us to do. All right, so that brings us to iOS 6. Apple, in my opinion, from having watched them for a number of years now, they basically do 3 things really well in big updates to the OS. The first thing that they do is they take simple things, mostly things that people were probably already doing themselves, either via third-party libraries, their own personal implementations, and they roll them right into the SDK and they provide you direct APIs to those sorts of things. Second thing is they do all kinds of new cool private things that we can't use yet, but we might get to use in the future. That's the good reason to pay attention to that. And the third thing is the dreaded Sherlock. Now, I don't know if anybody here is familiar with that term, but back in the days of System 8, back before it was called Mac OS X, it was called System 8, there was a web utility called Watson. And it was basically an internet search tool. And when System 8.5 came out, Apple bundled in their own version of this called Sherlock. And thus was born this concept of being Sherlocked. When what that means is that you build something amazing, Apple says, that is so cool, we're not actually going to buy you, we're just going to build it ourselves. And essentially obsolete your entire business model overnight. And this happens, unfortunately, more than I would like, more than a lot of people would like. Some examples of this from iOS 5, the most recent version, there was quite a bit of talk about iMessages. Now there's a lot of things like GroupMe and AIM and other kinds of instant messaging services, but the real story here was that Apple is actually trying to put text messaging out of business. They're actually taking on the carriers on this one because when you use an iMessage and it's all on iOS, it gets transferred as data, which means that you don't get charged for it by your carrier. So if you have like a 20 message limit or something like that on your phone bill, if you're iMessaging with other iOS users, and now with Mountain Lion, other Mac users, that does not come out of your phone bill anymore. Another example is reminders. As I said, this is a very crowded space. And Apple saw that and decided that they needed to have their own reminders app that came bundled on the phone. So they went ahead and did that. Another example is iCloud and Dropbox. Some people may not know this, but Apple actually tried to buy Dropbox when they were a fair bit smaller than they are now. Dropbox, for whatever reason, said, no thanks. We think we got this. You guys can go ahead and do your own thing. And so Apple was forced to implement their own. And if you've been paying attention to iCloud, you know that they maybe didn't do as good of a job as they could have if they had just been successful in purchasing Dropbox. They do, however, take a very different view of this whole syncing, file syncing concept with iCloud. Dropbox is a file system-based syncing utility. It's basically a big folder. You can drop stuff in there, and it will show up everywhere. iCloud, on the other hand, is sort of file system agnostic. You don't get to see where your files are stored or how. They're stored in the cloud, and when you need them, they ostensibly will be right where you need them exactly when you need them. And that's why I say I'm not so sure that they have succeeded as much as they would like, because there's still some issues with iCloud. They're hoping to fix some of those in iOS 6 and Mountain Lion. And then the final one is Game Center. Game Center was kind of like Xbox Live for your phone. And Apple will talk and talk and talk about what a great idea this is, but they didn't actually come up with it first, not surprisingly. There were several other companies. A couple of them are still around, some of them are not anymore. OpenFaint is one. You build a user ID, and they partnered with a number of games so that you could be sharing scores and leaderboards and all the rest of it. Another one was Plus Plus. But again, one of the cool things when Apple decides to do this is that they get to do stuff behind the scenes at a system level that third parties don't necessarily get to do. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's coming in Game Center for iOS 6 in just a moment. And the Sherlock is continuing in iOS 6. There's two very specific examples. Instapaper, which is an offline reading utility. Basically, it's a read it later service. Apple started this in Safari in iOS 5 and Lion, where you could store a link and have it synced via iCloud to all your devices. But now they've actually gone one step further, and they actually now will download that content, store it offline, so that the next time you want to read it, you don't actually have to reload it. And another example is this sort of notification center, global notifications thing versus something like Growl. Growl is, again, a system utility that is used basically for notifying the user audibly and visibly whenever an event occurs. There's badges in the dock and that sort of thing, but Growl is a way to put up a banner whenever something significant happens, and it's usually pretty configurable, so like you can have it whenever you get tweeted at, whenever you get a new email, whenever you get all kinds of various things. And so now Apple's building this in. So what does this mean to us as developers? Well, it means a couple things. First off, it means you got to consider your market very carefully. If you think you're going to make the next great read it later app, the power did not go out. I think he was just worried you guys were having a hard time seeing it. What that means is that if you think you've got the next great read it later app, you might want to hang out for a sec and see how Apple does this. Because unless you're bringing something really, really innovative to the table, Apple thinks they've got that covered, which means several things. One, it means you're probably not going to get featured on the App Store because they're going to be competing head-to-head with Apple. And it also means that unless you're actually building on top of Apple's solution, they're probably going to get to do stuff that you don't get to do because they can play with the private APIs in the background. However, if you're already in these markets, there's actually a decent amount of evidence that you'll be all right. As for instance, we were really nervous when Apple announced that they were going to have their own Reminders app. We were worried that the market for Reminder was going to dry up. And actually, it had a bit of the opposite effect. The number one piece of feedback we actually get for Reminder is, I found your app because I was using Apple's Reminders, and they're awful, and you're doing it better. So all hope is not lost. And also, there's good news, everybody, because now, and I don't know if this is a kindler, gentler Apple, but they're actually beginning to do sort of the opposite now, the anti-Sherlock. There's actually a couple examples in iOS 6 and Mountain Lion that show that Apple is actually willing to pull wholesale functionality they've already implemented completely out and throw it away and send people off to the app stores. In Lion and earlier, if you were to open up an RSS feed in Safari, you get a real basic readout of the RSS feed information. You do that in Mountain Lion, they send you to the App Store. Sorry, we don't read RSS feeds. Why don't you go look for an app? Similarly, Apple is implementing their own new maps in iOS 6. They're dumping Google and doing their own. One of the things you got with Google was when you did routing, you would get transit directions. And Apple's not implementing that. They're saying, we're just going to send people to the App Store. And now this is obviously still in the beta, so there are no matches yet. But you'll be able to actually have your app showing up there. So like the Muni app or the BART app, like when you're in San Francisco, those sorts of, I don't know if there's an RTA app. There probably isn't. But that sort of thing is showing that Apple is actually gaining a little bit of understanding with regards to how frustrating it can be for developers when they do this to them. All right, so number 2. Private APIs and system-level features. A lot of these are the sort of whiz-bang, isn't that neat stuff that they show off at the public keynotes that people want to see. So some examples of these are the new lock screen functions. So for instance, now when the phone rings, in the same way that when you double tap and you get that little thumb where you can flick it up and immediately use the camera, now when the phone rings, you're going to have a little thumb that you can flick up and you can reply with a text message. Oh, I'm busy, I'll call you back in 10 minutes. Or you can actually set a reminder to call that person back in, I think it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour, 45 minutes, something like that. Obviously private, we can't play with these yet. Another example is the do not disturb, the global do not disturb. Now this is a feature that sits sort of halfway in between your phone being completely on and functioning and airplane mode. Because when you turn on airplane mode, everything's shut down. No internet connection, no Bluetooth, no nothing. Do not disturb kind of sits right in the middle there. And what it basically allows you to do is say, I want you to silence everything, but let everything come in. So that when you wake up in the morning, you might flip it open and you'll see that all your notifications came in. They just weren't audible. They weren't vibrating your phone. But the coolest feature is this repeated calls thing. So if a second call comes in within 3 minutes, it will actually put that call through from the same number. And this is based on the idea that Apple's assuming if someone's trying to get in touch with you from that same number right away, it's probably an emergency and you're probably going to want to let that through. And this is one of the big problems with something like airplane mode. If you shut your phone down, you're cut off. Now I understand, yes, there's a wide group of people are saying, well, we're too connected anyway. Isn't it good to turn your phone off? That's all fine and well, but this is a really good beginning here. Another big one is Siri. We as developers, when we saw Siri, at least from my point of view, everybody was saying, when do we get to play with that? that is so cool. I want to be able to have my people just talking to my app right from the home screen. Unfortunately, we can't do that yet. We can ask it who's taller, LeBron or Kobe. If you're into basketball heights or scores or movie times, that's cool. But unfortunately, we don't get to play with Siri really yet. But again, there is kind of a sort of a silver lining to this cloud, and that is that Apple has been reaching out to select third parties and letting them sort of behind the scenes a little bit. So Yelp, OpenTable, Rotten Tomatoes, some of these places are now showing up directly in Siri. So now if you ask for, find me a sushi restaurant near here, it'll pop up a bunch of sushi restaurants, it'll show you Yelp reviews, it will allow you to make an OpenTable reservation right from in Siri. So it's not completely open yet, but it's still not completely, it's no longer completely locked down. And what that basically means is, again, private APIs often go public in later iterations of iOS. So while we can't use these things just now, it bodes well for us for the future. It means there's a good chance we may get a chance to play with them later. And there are examples of this. You know, for instance, Apple introduced reminders, as we've said now several times, in iOS 5. And the API that makes those work behind the scenes when you pop up Siri and say, Siri, remind me to pick up milk on the way home. That API has actually been opened up in iOS 6. It's called EventKit. And you can use it to set reminders on the system. You can use it to set geofenced reminders. You can use it to set calendar items. And so this was something that we could use in a very, very limited fashion before, but clearly existed in a more robust way. And Apple's now opening that up in the next version. And the last thing I'll say from the Apple point of view is this App Store redesign, which essentially a complete overhaul of the way the App Store looks on device. It's still yet to be seen if they're actually going to update iTunes in tandem with it. I'm hoping that they do, because iTunes is a fairly rickety, very bloated, old piece of software at this point. They've been updating bits and pieces of it piecemeal, but it really needs a big overhaul. I'm hoping that this shows that they are planning to do that as well when iOS 6 comes out. So now, specifically, one of the things is that on device, you can now have a company homepage, which you could have in iTunes before, but you could never have on device. If you tried to visit that same link on device, you would just get an error. And now that is over. Now you can actually go, and it looks really pretty. They have these big, huge icons, these really sort of using the space in a really good way that is, in my opinion, a lot better than the way the App Store looks currently. And one other really neat thing that they're doing is now, I don't know if you can see it, but they're actually badging when you first download an app. It's going to be badged with this new to let you know that you haven't launched it yet, which will definitely cut down on some of the issue where you have somebody, especially with free apps, where they'll hear about it, download it, it'll start downloading, then they'll go do something else, they'll come back, it'll end up somewhere on their home screen where they don't know where it is, and then they never launch it. I don't know how much loss occurs from that. I'd say for our point of view, it's probably between like 3 to 5% of an app like Reminder that gets, you know, between 500 and 600 downloads a day. Our analytics don't show us all of those actually being launched and used. So, you know, being able to actually see this in a really obvious way on the home screen, I think will help with that. All right, so number 3. This is the stuff that we as developers are most interested in probably. The new public APIs that Apple's allowing us to use. Now, this slide is sort of the user-facing, like what the features look like. From a developer point of view, this slide is the one that's probably a little bit more interesting. Again, here's Forstall talking about it at Worldwide Developer Conference. So these are all of the various new concepts that are core to iOS that we're going to be able to use. And they come in several different flavors. One is what I was talking about in my first list, things that have sort of been standardized. This new sharing sheet that will pop up anywhere is basically a standardized version of a third-party library called ShareKit. If you've worked on iOS recently and you ever wanted to use social networking, you basically had a couple different options. You could do whatever Apple let you do, or you could probably roll your own. But most people were doing ShareKit. It was a collection of sort of open source libraries that would share to all the major services, so Flickr, Twitter, Facebook, a number of other ones. And Apple has essentially taken that functionality and name wholesale, and they're calling theirs ShareKit as well. So it's kind of a Sherlock 2. And what it basically allows you to do is, from a system level, you can now have the user log in to Twitter once, system-wide, and they never have to enter their credentials again. They can just pull it up whenever you want them to be able to use Twitter. You just put up this sharing sheet, and they can pull and post to all of these various services. They've added Facebook. I believe they're adding Flickr as well, but it's not on my screenshot. A couple of other things that they are going to be standardizing is this idea of PassKit. Now these are, if you've traveled by air recently, you may have used a electronic boarding pass, which basically allows you to bring up a barcode on your phone that will get scanned. I apologize if I'm dripping here, it is a little warm. Well, you bring up something that can be scanned right on your phone, and Apple is actually going to go ahead and try and standardize that across the platform. To be able to support things other than boarding passes, it'll be able to support tickets for concerts, it'll be able to support gift cards, basically anything that could ever need to be storing information. This is kind of Apple's way, in my opinion, of doing a bit of an end run around this idea of near-field communications. Near-field communications is the idea of you put a chip in the phone, the chip stores information on it. If you want to pay for something, for instance, you wave your phone over something, the chip in the phone talks to the chip in the thing, and then some money changes hands, what have you. Apple's sort of doing this from a more server-client, client-server point of view, where they're saying the information will be encoded in the barcode. You scan the barcode will check in with a server somewhere that knows how much money you have left on your account, we'll debit it, we'll update the information, and next time you use it, everything will all be in place. It looks pretty slick in demos. I haven't seen it working up front, like right in front of me yet, but so this is just another one of those things that Apple is trying to standardize. A number of other tools that we'll be able to use as developers to make our lives easier are coming also. Auto layout, if you've worked on the Mac side, auto layout has existed since Lion, and what auto layout is essentially a constraint-based layout system in opposition to the idea of a specific hard-coded layout system. And if you've worked in web design, you know what the power of this is. You know, you can either make a table-based layout that puts everything exactly where you want it to be, or you can now use this concept of responsive design, whereby a single page will look great on your browser on your desktop, it'll look great on your iPad, it'll look even better on your tiny little mobile device. And auto layout essentially does that for iOS apps and for Mac apps. Collection views are another really, really powerful tool. This was sort of the darling of Worldwide Developer Conference. Everybody wanted to hear about collection views. They were very popular, and they seem to be pretty powerful. I also probably should have mentioned I don't personally write code. I understand the concepts behind code, but I don't myself write the code. So if anything I say does seem right, but maybe I got the syntax wrong, that's probably why. Rich text views. Regular text views on iOS up to this point, if you wanted to do any sort of rich formatting like bold, italics, different fonts in the same thing, was a huge nightmare unless you decided to use an HTML view, or I'm sorry, a web view. And that's changing now in iOS 6. You'll be able to do much more interesting rich text formatting without having to resort to HTML markup, which is good because there were some things that work somewhat differently in web views than they do in just a typical like main iOS native view. And so sometimes it could be difficult bouncing back and forth between the two if you wanted certain functionality from one and the other. Multi-route audio is a pretty neat thing. This is going to allow something like sending different audio through the internal speaker and through the headphones. Just one example of something you might want to do with this is, let's say you've got a group game and you wanted to have a certain kind of audio coming out for everybody to hear, but you wanted something specific going into the headphones of somebody playing on their iOS device. So maybe you've got a game board on the iPad and that's playing something specific, but the Dungeon Master has their headphones plugged in and they get to hear something slightly different. StoreKit. StoreKit is basically, up to this point, it's what you would use for in-app purchases. So if you have a game and you're doing microtransactions, you're using StoreKit to sell. But StoreKit is getting a lot more powerful in iOS 6. You'll be able to sell not only your own in-app purchases, but essentially anything from the App Store within your app without leaving, which is pretty powerful, especially when you look at, like, for instance, GameMinder. We sell iOS games through GameMinder. And so whenever somebody taps on that buy this game thing, it opens up a URL, they get kicked out, they go back out to the store, they buy their game, we get credit for it, bully for us, but now they're not in our app anymore. With StoreKit, the main thing is to keep that engagement level high. You can now sell songs, movies, anything you want right in the app. It pops up a sheet, they do what they need to do, they release the sheet, and they're still right in your app. So they can keep browsing, they can find another game, they find another app, another song, what have you. And then the last one I already mentioned, EventKit, reminders. Gaming. I know I see at least one person from the Cleveland Game Developers meetup here. Was anybody else here? Does anybody else remember that group? No? I mentioned that I was going to be doing this there as well. So there is some really cool stuff coming in Game Center. Game Center, as I mentioned before, was Apple's attempt to do their own sort of Xbox Live. And again, because they get to do things at a system level, they can do a lot more than what a lot of these other third parties could do. Game groups is the biggest one. Game Groups now is going to allow you to arbitrarily define a grouping of games outside of simply their bundle ID. And what that means is, in the example that they use, is let's say that we've released our game Uncle Slam. It's a universal app, and it's on iPad and iPhone. Let's say we wanted to release a Mac App Store version of that. It's universal on iPad and iPhone, so those versions are essentially one version, so they can play against each other, they can talk to each other. But we can't play with the Mac App Store version. With Game Groups now we can, which allows us to do things like sharing achievements, sharing in-app purchases, sharing leaderboards, all that kind of stuff. It makes it really simple to do, too. Also, the Game Center in-app experience is really, you're actually going to see, if you play with the betas and then once it comes out, you'll see that Facebook like buttons are dropping everywhere. Apple's really pushing now. Now finally, I think there was some rumors that they were going to try and do Facebook integration last year when they did Twitter integration, but it never really happened. It's finally starting to happen in a big way. When you unlock an achievement, you'll be able to go right in, staying within your app. You're able to go right in, look at it, hit a like, share it on Facebook, share it on Twitter, challenge your friends to beat you. So that's pretty cool. All right, so that is a lot of sort of some of the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts. But let's talk a little bit about actually being a citizen of the App Store. So let's say you took to heart everything that I just told you. You've got a really great idea for an app. You're not even going to bother with iOS 5. You're going to design it straight for iOS 6 because you know you're going to be in development for a few months. It's supposed to come out in the fall. So you build your app. You log into your iTunes Connect account. You set it all up. You get your metadata all in place. You get your screenshots all in place. You've used all the cool new Game Center features. You have put a bunch of in-app purchases in there. You're gonna ride this microtransactions concept all the way to glory. You've got your leaderboards all set. You got everything. And then you try to decide how you're going to launch. When are you going to launch? Now, we've been doing this for, like I said, since sort of mid-2010. In 2010, our average review time was about 8.5 days. 2011, it was under 5. But now in 2007, it's been getting a little bit longer. It's almost back up to 6 again. And we also know, based on, I think we've had somewhere in the mid-50s in terms of total submissions. That includes brand new apps, updates to those apps, in-app purchases. And almost every single one of them was less than 24 hours in review. So based on this, we're looking at these things and we say our update to Uncle Slam has to do with the election, and we want to launch it on the 4th of July because, birth of our country, it's, big patriotic, what have you. So we do some math and we figure we should probably submit it somewhere around the 21st of June. So basically, if we submit it on the 21st of June, that gives us, can't really see the lines on my calendar, but it gives us about 7 days. Our expected approval is like in the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday area here. That gives us another week to get all of our marketing in order and make sure that we can have a nice, fantastic launch. Now, when we get through Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and then Thursday, and then Friday, and then the whole weekend, and we still haven't heard from Apple, and our first contact from them is 2 days before we're hoping to launch, and it hasn't even gone into review yet. The first contact that we get from Apple on that day says, this app requires further review. Now, I know some of you said you've been on the App Store, so I don't know how many of you actually experienced this, but there's basically 3 things that can happen to you when you submit an app. It can be approved, woo, yay. It can be rejected, But the cool thing about being rejected is that Apple tells you exactly why you were rejected, and more often than not, it's something simple. We've been rejected a couple times. I'll talk about the rejections in just a minute. But so our hopes of launching on the 4th of July were dashed. If they haven't even gone into review yet on the 2nd, and now they're telling us that we need extra time, there's no way we're launching that day. So the rest of that week goes through. We get to Monday the next week. We're probably not going to launch that day either. We get all the way to July 16th, which means that we were actually in review for 25 days. Now, we gave due diligence, we gave ourselves a pretty solid window there. But as my marketing guy can attest to, we were not prepared for the idea of not launching anywhere near the time that we thought we were going to. All of our marketing, all of our development time, all of everything was based around the idea we were going to launch on July 4th. So we had to scramble. We really did. So what happens in this situation? What do? You know, you've done everything you were supposed to do. You listened to me and you built it exactly the way you're supposed to. You used all of Apple's cool whiz-bang features. What do? Most important thing is don't panic. Because I know that the first time we got rejected, that's what I did. I flipped. I was like, oh my God, what are we going to do? Oh my, da, 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 da. Apple, more often than not, is pretty good. There's been a lot of horror stories about the Apple approval process over the years. They've gotten a lot better. But as this tale shows, they're not 100%. I wish they were more communicative. I do. That's why another reason I was kind of hoping that guy from Apple was going to be here, because I wanted to pick his brain a little bit about why they do it like this. Why couldn't they just have told us why we needed extra review time? Who knows? They didn't want to tell us. So why bother? You know, if this is the way Apple's going to treat their valued partners, why do we bother? Why do we develop for iOS? Some more numbers for you. So as I said, GameMinder just went out for Android. It was our first foray into Android development. Our last update for GameMinder, which was about a month and a half ago, the Apple App Store version went through in about 7 days from submission to approval available on the store. The Google Play version, Google Play does not have an approval process. So you basically, once you get your ducks in a row and you sign up and you submit it, it's just as long as it takes for them to process it and actually get it posted, that's how long it takes. The Amazon App Store, on the other hand, is a little funky. They're kind of halfway in between. They do have an approval process, and we actually did get rejected the first time. We weren't using our SSL in exactly the right way, which was something we weren't actually aware of. We probably would have never caught it, but they caught it, and they knew that we were passing a password in the clear, and so we needed to fix that. And so we got rejected. But this was not that rejection. This was from the day that we submitted it. 7 days, it got approved. But Amazon has another step called live. And it took us 7 days for some reason to go from approved to live on the actual Amazon store. And so, you know, I mean, the walled garden on one side, completely open in the middle, and somewhere in between on the end. But let's look at some of the numbers then, because our launch week for our Android app carried with it a very specific targeted advertising campaign for Android. The messaging was, we are launching for Android today. This green line here is our reminder. So as you can see, it's pretty steady. We don't, as I said, we don't market it. It sort of comes with the ebb and flow of the App Store itself. So that's sort of your control group. The dark blue line is the iOS numbers, and the light blue line is the Android numbers. As you can see, a advertising campaign targeted for Android with messaging for Android caused 2 to 3 times as many iOS apps to be downloaded than Android apps. Now this is a free app, so it's not the issue of, you know, what you'll hear a lot of people say, which is, well, Android people don't want to spend money and Apple people do. So it's not that. There's more, ostensibly there are more Android devices out there that could run this app. So it's not that. Our experience has shown us that more volume moves on iOS. So that should hopefully answer the question of why bother. In a lot of ways, iOS is the more development-friendly platform if you want more people using your app. A lot of the processes are easier. Getting support is easier, despite the fact that there is that random black hole that will occur occasionally when you're trying to deal with Apple. So how exactly do you work effectively? I know that was sort of the subheading to this talk. How do you work effectively? In my opinion, there are basically 3 things that you can do. You can take your cues from Apple, like I said, moving the ball down the field, pulling people forward with you as you sort of move into this brave new future that Apple is creating for us in the mobile space. Move as fast as you can. The idea of a multi-year development cycle, forget it. You're done. And I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here if we're talking about, you know, this is a rapid development environment, you know, and even more so on mobile, and now it's coming back to the Mac. Things are moving fast, and you got to move to keep up with it. The cool thing about this is that a lot of the functionality that you'll need to do most of the basics either already exist as APIs that Apple's built for you, or you can find a lot of really terrific third-party libraries that can help you do a lot of these things as well. You know, if the minutia of how do I communicate to a server? How do I sell an in-app purchase? How do I organize this stuff on screen? If the vast majority of that stuff is done by the API, you have a lot more time, and most of the code you get to write then is your idea. It's what is your app going to do. You don't have to worry about all of the stuff that's underneath the hood. It's all handled by the APIs, mostly, I would hope. And third is be prepared to roll with the punches. As I said, Apple sometimes will just blindside you, and it's unfortunate, but that's the way that it is. It's what you're signing up for. It's what we signed up for. And that's what I got. So did anybody have any questions, something I didn't cover? Or something I did cover that you wanted more information about? Yeah.
When you do these ads, what do you program first? Do you do the Objective-C or do you do like your server side first?
It really depends. A question was basically about what sort of development schedule. Do you start with the server side? Do you start with the client side? What do you do? It really depends. You know, GameMinder was an app that is very coupled. You know what I mean? Like without the server, the app is pretty useless, and without the app, the server side is basically just a dumb API endpoint. So that one was developed very much in tandem. Uncle Slam, on the other hand, the gameplay was the main thing. So we spent the vast majority of our time doing the gameplay, and then we implemented some sort of basic supporting server-side stuff very late in the development cycle. So things like stats tracking. There's a lot of it that gets handled right in Game Center. But a couple things that we wanted to do weren't really supported by Game Center. It's more like for instance, UncleSlam.com now has a statistics display where you can see, you can pick any two presidents, put them head to head, and you can see how they've performed against one another in the game. That sort of a thing isn't really directly supported by Game Center, so we had to implement that ourselves. And we store all of that on our own servers, but that was built very late in the development cycle. So.
When you submit an app, I know you said it took like 25 days or whatever. Let's say you're willing to wait like a month or so.
Mm-hmm.
Can you set a date that it absolutely launches?
Mm-hmm.
That?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's actually a couple different ways to do that. One is you can actually set a date, or two is you can just set it to what's called developer hold, which basically means go ahead and approve this, put this through the process, and I'll let you know. And that's actually, when we first started, we almost always checked the release it as soon as it's ready button, because we were, young and naive, and we just wanted to get it out there, you know what I mean? But more recently now, especially because, as I said, a couple of our first forays into the App Store was we built what we thought was a great app, but we hadn't really thought out the marketing side of things. And so what we've learned from there is develop it, get it ready, get it submitted, then sit down and really work out the marketing. And especially in situations like with Uncle Slam, we had worked out our marketing. We had planned it, but we just ended up with the wrong timeline. So what we do nowadays is almost always we set it to developer hold, just so that when it goes live, even if it, because here's another little interesting tidbit about the App Store. They work 24 hours a day. We've had apps approved at 1 in the morning, and on Sundays. So they work, I don't know if it's, who knows where they're located? I don't know where they're reviewing these apps. My understanding is that they're all reviewed in California, but I don't know if that's 100% true. But they literally are reviewing them at all hours of the day and night. So you could get an app reviewed at 1 a.m., goes live, and you don't find out about it until you wake up the next morning. So nowadays, we basically just set everything to developer hold. If it goes live late at night, we'll just wait and deal with it in the morning usually. So. Yeah.
You just mentioned marketing. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how you do market the apps you guys produce.
Well, I'm hesitating because we're still learning. The economics of the App Store are a very interesting thing right now. As I think most people know, even on Apple, selling a paid app is a very difficult proposition. And I actually just read last week that free app, the free-to-play game market right now, is looking at $7 per user acquisition rates, which is ridiculous. Especially if you're talking about apps that are either free-to-play or $1. If you're spending $7 to get somebody to spend $1 with you, that's no way to run a business. Some of the things that we've found recently that have worked well is sort of thinking outside the box. The original ideas a lot were, banner advertising. We're going to do AdMob ads. We're going to serve them to mobile phones, and people are going to be right on their phones, so they're going to tap it and they're going to download the app right on their mobile phones. Everything's going to be great. iAd, all of these sort of banner advertising, like pop-up, interrupt the user, whatever. None of those have given us any sort of reasonable return, and we've tried them all. what we've been doing mostly recently is doing targeted outreach to very specific things. Like for instance, I was mentioning this hashtag with GameMinder here. We're working with, after a lot of trial and error, we found what we consider to be the exact right target market for GameMinder. And they almost all listen to the Rooster Teeth podcast, it turns out. So we have worked very closely with the Rooster Teeth podcast to craft a marketing campaign that is very specific for that group. We've sponsored their podcast. We went to their trade show or gaming expo, what have you, about a month ago. And we basically took our message directly to the people that we wanted to sell to. Instead of this idea of, there's 100 million iPhones out there, let's try and get on all of them. We really brought it a lot more closer to the concept of who wants to use our app, let's talk directly to those people. Literally, like stand in front of them and talk to them, here's why you should use my app. And that's been working out really well for GameMinder. The numbers have been rising. And again, I mean, a lot of that Android launch was, that targeted marketing I was talking about was for that podcast. It was basically, the messaging was, you know, GameMinder, they just came out with their Android app this week. You should go try it. It's on Google Play, it's on Amazon, go try it. And as you saw, I think just the idea of the name of GameMinder, people were trying it on their mobile devices, and more of them were using the iOS operating system. You know, other than that, I would say partner with people who know more about it than you do. You know, that's one of the reasons I've been working with ThunderTech, is that when I started, I really thought, I caught the very tail end of the gold rush, of the app gold rush, where if you had a really good idea and a decent implementation, you were going to get 1 million downloads and you were going to win, and you were going to be an App Store millionaire. I started right as that was like cresting and ending, so I didn't ever catch that. And it's really become much more like, you know, as much as I talk about, you know, how a lot of things are moving so fast and it's you know, everything's so crazy, a lot of it is moving right back into the world of like the traditional business, you know what I mean? Like you make a product, you have customers who like it, and you market directly to those customers. So the trick is figuring out how much money to spend. You know, if you think you've got an app that, you know, like for instance, with GameMinder, we're hoping to make a heck of a lot more than $7 on each user, because we want them to be buying every game that they play from this day forward. We want them to buy it through our app. And so in some ways, we don't have a problem spending that kind of money for user acquisition. But if you are Instagram, who has no idea what you're going to be what your users are going to do to give you money, and in fact, you have gone out of your way to not plan on making money because your Instagram is so cool, you're counting on Facebook to buy you for $1 billion. And there's room for 1, maybe 2 of those a year. So, anybody else?
You said you found your technical co-founder in like Nova Scotia. How did you exactly hook up with that person?
Yeah, we were both members of arstechnica.com, and it's a tech website. If you don't know, they call it a tech blog, but it's actually it's sort of existed a long time before blogging was really a thing. And they have a really active user forum, and I was friends with him. We played Xbox Live games together. And his name on the forum implied that he was a developer. And so I basically just asked him, you know, we were playing Rock Band one night. I was like, hey, do you write, like, what languages do you write in? Do you write for the Mac? Do you write for whatever? And he was like, oh yeah, I do Mac, but I've dabbled in iOS. And I was like, well, hey, I've got some ideas. Let's give it a try. So he was actually living in Edmonton, Alberta at the time. But yeah, that was how I met him. I actually knew him for a couple years without even knowing that he was a developer. And then we just sort of gave it a shot.
So you're doing all your stuff in native iOS. Do you have any experience or thought on native iOS versus like PhoneGap or Titanium or any of those other frameworks?
Yeah, well, actually, our GameMinder version is a PhoneGap port, essentially. What it is basically, when we showed off GameMinder at our very first convention, we went to PAX East, which is a big gaming conference. PAX East is in Boston, and PAX Prime is in Seattle. And we showed it off, and a lot of people were like, that's awesome. Can I get it for Android? So what we took that to mean was, let's make GameMinder.com a great mobile web experience, and then that'll work for everybody. That was the idea. So we did that. And what we found was that people, by and large, were not using it as a website. Like, they were getting to it, and they were saying, this is interesting, and then they were looking for an app. So we basically used PhoneGap to wrap the website up in a native app, and we released it as an Android app. A couple of things we got by doing that we wouldn't have gotten on the website was we were able to implement push notification as well as a certain amount of limited local data storage so that we can cache certain information that we couldn't do quite as effectively in a mobile website. It's a good stopgap measure. It'll get you through, but I don't think it's a good long-term plan, at least not in the way that it's working these days. Having worked with it only just a little bit and only with one app, that was a very specific type of app. I can't speak to how well it might work for other types of things. Like I don't know how it might work for games or other kinds of things like that. But I do know that we're considering using it to make a Windows Mobile version just to see, because we've had some requests for a Windows Mobile version of GameMinder. And again, as a stopgap, like what can we get out there quickly without having to put too much development time in? And so that would be how we would use PhoneGap. But we are probably, for the next major version of GameMinder, going to redevelop in a more effective native fashion, because I think that it's effective in getting people using the system, but it's not a very compelling experience, at least is my experience. So.
Just like this, how long did it take you to port from a web app to a phone app?
Not long. Because really the only thing we had to, I think, was maybe probably about 2 months, a month of which was bug hunting. Because the actual, I mean, like I said, it's literally the website sort of wrapped up. And the only things we had to implement ourselves was push notification and some of the local data storage. And so there was very little new code being written. And because of that, it was basically like, we actually had a version running as an APK within a day, because it was just sort of like, okay, we'll have it import this website and have it, build the wrapper and put it on a device, and then it was a question of, okay, well, what else do we want this to do now? Now that's of course developing in HTML. PhoneGap, I think, also allows you to develop in other ways and then sort of publish to various platforms, right?
No, it's mostly HTML.
Is it mostly HTML5? Okay. Well, I should also mention that our mobile thing was in jQuery Mobile, which we had very bad experience with. As I understand, jQuery is really cool. jQuery Mobile, not so much. We had a really hard time making it work effectively cross-platform. So, it works great on iOS, but that was the one platform we didn't need it to really work well on. So it wasn't really the best choice. Anything else? All right. Well, I had some information up here. This is sort of my brain droppings. That's not really like my company. That's just sort of where I write occasionally. You can follow me, follow Launchhouse, follow Handel. And if you want to win an Xbox 360, you can tweet with that hashtag. If you want to get in touch with me, you can get in touch with me on any of these things, and then all of our projects are at the bottom there. So, now I know, Dar, you had said you wanted to maybe open it up to some.
Yeah, we'll see. So, thank you, first of all. It was awesome.
My pleasure.
And